Okay, let's get started. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the joint QUT Centre for Data Science and Queensland Academy of Arts and Science webinar panel discussion related to data science in the news, but also a little bit more generally coming into 2022, where we're going to talk a little bit about life going a little bit digital post-pandemic. So post-pandemic is life just permanently digital. And the subtitle, which isn't on the slide that I've got up at the moment, is we're going to talk a little bit about some aspects of digital citizenship, digital safety, digital skills, digital pedagogy, digital well-being, and digital self-control or digital awareness. And so with that in mind, I've put together, I'm the moderator, my name is Michael Cowling. You can see my face there on the left-hand side, and I've put together a panel for us of experts that can talk about this area. And I told them no slides and then promptly put up a slide at the beginning. But the idea, the reason why I have put up the slide is because I wanted to let you know that we have had a late breaking change in our panel. Unfortunately, Dr. Amy Johnson, who is a colleague of mine from Central Queensland University, emailed us yesterday and told us that she has COVID. Apparently it's going around, as it were, has been for at least a couple of years. And so we've had a switch in our panel members to Robert Vanderburg, who is now there on the slides, and there's his name just so that you know he is not Amy Johnson. And Robert is also a colleague of mine from Central Queensland University. He is an expert in education, a senior lecturer in education at Central Queensland University. And so I think a great substitute, rig-in, alternate for Amy Johnson. So I just wanted to let you know, and that's why I thought I'd put the slides up. As well as that, we also have, and maybe the panelists might turn on their mic and just say hello so that their screen pops up and they wave. We also have Dr. Kwong Nui Sim from Auckland University of Technology, and Kwong Nui is a learning consultant at Auckland University of Technology and is an expert in higher education, especially as it relates to digital technology. So hello, Kwong Nui.
Hello, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. And kia ora from New Zealand.
We also have Dr. Jo Orlando, and Dr. Jo Orlando is from the University of Western Sydney. She is based in New South Wales and Sydney, obviously, in the media a lot in New South Wales, and recently published a book related to digital well-being, which, tell me if I get this wrong, Jo, is called Life Mode On. And I'm sure Jo wouldn't mind if I plugged that you should go and buy Jo's book. I'm sure it is an awesome book, but Jo is also obviously an expert in digital well-being. So welcome, Jo.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to talk.
And then finally, last but not least, certainly, we have Professor Matt Bellgard. And Professor Matt is from QUT. He's another one of our Queensland presence. We tried our best to balance the Queenslanders with the non-Queenslanders, since this is QUT and the QAAS. And so Matt is a professor at QUT, e-research director, I think, as well, Matt, with a focus on health and digital safety and privacy. So hi, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. Hi to you all, and thank you to the Centre for Data Science for the opportunity.
Awesome. So welcome to all my panel, and thank you so much for coming along. And so what we're going to talk about today, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to talk about that concept of digital citizenship. And I've been thinking about this idea for a while. And the reason that I've been thinking about it for a while is because I do a lot of work with school students. And so here's the slide of me pointing out the plank from Richie's Plank Experience to a student at to a child at the World Science Festival in Gladstone. That one's not actually in Brisbane, it's actually in Gladstone. And I also fly about as a flying scientist, putting kids in VR headsets and experiencing robotics and all of those kinds of things. And as I've thought about this, and as we've started to think about this, I've realized that this concept of digital citizenship is actually a really broad concept. And that when we talk about digital citizenship, it's not necessarily just about skills, which we do actually talk about a lot. And Kwong Nui is an expert in that area, but also about other aspects of digital citizenship. And so I've started to sell this model right? And the model that I've started to sell is this idea of the 4 S's of the modern iKid. And the 4 S's are skills, safety, screen time, and self-control. And you could argue that screen time should be called well-being. You could argue that self-control should be called awareness, but I wanted 4 S's. So I kind of came up with words that worked for our 4 S's. And we've talked a bit about skills already, and I mentioned that Matt's in safety, and of course Joe's in wellbeing, and Robert thinks about digital awareness. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to unpack some of these ideas and have a think about that title question, which is that post-pandemic, is life going all digital? And if life is going all digital, then what do we need to think about in terms of the kids and the students, and maybe also the adults and society in general, and what they might be thinking about in terms of their digital citizenship, not only for education, but also more broadly as well. That's it for me for slides. I told you there weren't going to be many slides. And so that's it for me for slides. But I'm going to pass on over to our panel now, and they're going to talk about some of those ideas. And I already told you that she's in the media all the time. And so I'm going to start with Jo Orlando to kick us off. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about digital wellbeing. And the specific question I have for Jo is, can you tell us a little bit about screen time and wellbeing and why you think that's so important for our students? And yes, feel free, despite my insistence, feel free to share a slide if you think it's useful.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Screen time, I think, is an interesting word. I've been in this research area for a number of years, and I've kind of followed the path of screen time and how it's evolved. So it's evolved into a word or a concept that really defines whether technology use is healthy or not. And it's particularly associated with children's technology use. But since the onset of COVID, it's also become into the conversations around adults' technology use and whether that's healthy or not. So the term, in its basic form, the term screen time refers to the amount of time we spend on a digital screen, whether it's our phone or laptop or tablet. And it's actually the numerical count in hours and minutes on one's technology use. And we've seen screen time recommendations for children in terms of how many hours a child should be spending on a screen, outside of school. And those kinds of things have continued to come up, but they've also continued to fade away. But, this term, screen time, has become much more than simply kind of a measure of time on using technology. The concept has also evolved into this very emotionally charged concept that's often used as a benchmark when thinking about the health and well-being of a child. So the dominant discourse that has been around for a number of years now is that screen time hinders a child's well-being and it stops them from doing things that we typically associate with a healthy childhood, like running around the backyard or talking to their little brother or spending time with their parents. And if we look at the scholarly literature, there continues to be this dominant strand that focuses on proving that screen time is bad for children. So such studies often begin with a bias that screen time is bad and then often set about in some way to prove this, whether it's harming a child's learning or eyesight or mental health. We see everything and anything, and it still is a very dominant strand in the research around children's uses of technology. And it's continued for a number of years now. Now, perhaps this kind of approach to thinking about screen time was needed. It's a kind of cautionary approach and has been needed in the beginning phases of using technology. But as we know, over the last few years, our technology use has become much more complex, much more integrated into every aspect of our lives. And the ways we use technology has completely exploded in ways that we wouldn't have ever imagined. And COVID has been particularly influential in how we use technology now and the extent that we use it across our lives. So from where I see it, I think that beginning phase of using technology is well and truly over. We're in another phase now almost like pre-COVID and post-COVID, or now, if we're going to call ourselves post-COVID. So the concept of screen time at this stage is quite limiting, because it really isn't doing anything apart from considering the amount of time we spend on a device. And given that our technology use has become much more complex, and what we do on there has become much more varied with different purposes and engaging with different kinds of content, that the idea of digital wellbeing is a much more kind of sustainable and meaningful way of considering how we think about healthy and balanced technology use. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I've put together a diagram of how I've been thinking about it lately. And it's a little bit of a work in progress, this diagram. So this is how we kind of were thinking about healthy technology use before. And this is particularly around children, but it kind of equally serves how we've been thinking about adults and healthy technology use. So cyber safety and screen time were the two things that we measured healthy technology use. But if we look at it from a framework of digital wellbeing, and my framework is continuing to develop as we sit and see how we're using technology now. And as I said, the pandemic's been particularly influential. So we still have screen time and measuring kind of hours and minutes, 24/7 on your screen, all of us know isn't a good way of approaching technology use. But there are other aspects that have become also important for wellbeing in terms of technology, and that is how we engage with others and communicate with others. So in terms of quality digital relationships, whether they be people we know, or how we engage with celebrities in comments or anything like that. Quality digital content, there's such a range of content online. What's quality and what's not quality in terms of the impact it has on us. Self-awareness of our technology habits and the kinds of addictive behaviours we may be developing, checking our phone every 12 minutes is the new average. So, how do we get to this point? And screen time, and then a more comprehensive understanding of digital literacy, part of which includes cyber safety, but also that more complex understanding of how we really understand the kind of content that we're seeing online, and the reasoning behind the post, and the kind of language that's used, and the kind of images that are used, and the kind of momentum that kind of content gets while we're on the screen. So that's where I'm up to in my kind of thinking in terms of digital wellbeing. So shifting from quite a narrower, more cautious focus on screen time to a much more comprehensive, multifaceted understanding of what wellbeing means in relation to how we use our technology.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that, Joe. You landed exactly where I expected you to land, which is when I first met you, I thought I love Jo Orlando because she's totally against this idea of banning devices in classrooms, and you sold it well. So I continue to love Jo Orlando. So let's talk to Matt for a minute. You actually gave me a great segue because you said this also includes components of safety. And so Matt's area is he's the director of e-research. Tell me if I've got that wrong, Matt, at QUT, but also has a great interest in safety and security, particularly as it relates to health. And so, Matt, did you want to give us a few minutes on why you think this is an important characteristic in the digital age?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And Joe, great introduction and background. Thank you. But I would like to put forward that digital safety is perhaps the most important of your 4 S's, Michael. And I'm going to put forward that case. The pandemic is the all-time disruptor, and certainly has enforced, the word force becomes a really important word, enforced stay at home for workers and families, physical isolation and family members, friends, colleagues, and even support networks. And the internet became that essential medium to do everything: socialize, to learn, to play, to be entertained. When we look at some of the statistics, the International Telecommunications Union from the United Nations, the internet usage grew from 2019 about 54%, 4.1 billion, to about, I think, 4.9%, so 63%, so 10%, the largest increase in a decade. And of course, there's, by the way, 2.9, I think, billion that are offline, and 350 million don't even have access to mobile broadband. But certainly those technological advances with this internet usage, social media opportunities, to keep people safe, informed and connected. And certainly the World Economic Forum basically highlighted that 1.2 billion children worldwide were displaced from classrooms. So we've seen a rise in EdTech, and that's been absolutely fantastic. And when we start talking about safety, the downside then is we're amplifying a whole range of vulnerabilities, exacerbating the negative aspects of internet and unsavory online elements. I don't have to go through the list, but the sorts of ones that I think I would like to highlight: online abuse, cyberbullying, trolling, scams, perverse online cultures. And I think the two other key elements I just want to draw out is digital reputations can be so unforgiving. One ill-considered act, and we could think about the Academy Awards this week, can potentially haunt you for the rest of your life, impacting you, your family, and importantly, your mental health. And then the other dimension I think I just want to highlight is that the misinformation. The World Health Organization sort of refers to fake news as the infodemic that can undermine global measures to control pandemics. So I guess they're the real negative sides, and I just want to highlight two examples. So from education and health. So for young children, digital safety, significant challenge. The E-Safety Commission in Australia is certainly making great strides in highlighting what those risks are for the sort of increased usage of the internet. And of course, there's a lot of training for educators in their behavioural change, and we're witnessing those changes. But I guess the other dimension is that at home, young children can't always be supervised, given the competing demands of parents and guardians, working from home, caring for other family members. And certainly my colleague, Professor Susan Danby from the Australian Catholic University, highlights that young children from the age of 0 to 5 are known users of the internet, and very little research has been really undertaken, and they're at most risk. And then the final area, Michael, just in terms of a health context, talking about forced uptake of telehealth, and it's been a real positive 60% uptake, and has been so transformative to reach marginalised and vulnerable communities in regional and rural areas, and certainly the area of rare diseases that I'm passionate about, 200 million people in the APEC region alone. But this gives rise to a whole range of safety issues around data privacy, patient safety and respect, and which also then now what we're seeing and what we're involved in is the importance of data governance frameworks, the equity of access, ethics, consent, the use and appropriate use and effective use of personal health information as for primary use as well as secondary use to improve health outcomes. So I might stop there, Michael.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Matt. You mentioned the E-Safety Commissioner, which is great. You also mentioned how things are still need work to be done and things are a little bit more holistic. And of course, I brought you on because I think health and privacy is one of those areas we need to think about a lot. And so I love the fact that you mentioned telehealth at the forcing of telehealth being really, really important, but also a challenge in the health space. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to hand over to Kwong Nui, and Kwong Nui, as I mentioned in my introduction, works at AUT in Auckland, so across the pond in New Zealand, and has a focus on learning and teaching in the higher education sector. And so I'm going to ask Kwong Nui, sort of touching on what Matt said about how everybody's getting online now, and Joe said this a little bit as well. What skills do you think that our students need, or just society as a whole needs, now that we're in this digital world?
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everyone again. And thanks, Joe and Matt, for the very interesting side of looking at the digital use. And I think it appears to us that digital technologies use mostly is during your personal time. Hence, we are talking about the well-being and the safety part. But as we move into the education sector, I guess the digital technologies play a very, very important role, especially amid global pandemic when the physical spaces are all disrupted. So I would like to start my one with two big questions, I suppose. To what extent has the use of the digital technology actually enhance our teaching and learning in education, which is from the pedagogical side of things? Or the other way around, to what extent have the teaching and learning practices, which is the pedagogy side of things, driven or determined the use of digital technologies? So in short, maybe if I would challenge us, all of us further, have we ever really using digital technologies for teaching and learning? As an academic developer in the previous institution and in the current institution, they name it as learning and teaching consultant. So I guess learning and teaching go hand in hand. We can't separate learning from teaching, or we can't separate teaching from learning. So one of the reality as an academic developer supporting staff for teaching and learning, working with senior management at the university to talk about how we can improve teaching and learning. But one of the reality, as we all know, tons of literature has shown us that during the pandemic, back in 2020, when it first started, when we move things online, it becomes like an emergency shift. It becomes surviving. I think one of the colleagues mentioned this yesterday about how we survive using technology for this purpose. And as you can see from the literature, both teachers and students have this challenge over the last 2 years, and now moving into the third year. And working in the central unit at the university, the support is continuous until today, with sometimes with a lot of times with similar questions, similar challenges. So that's back to the question, have we actually ready for the use of technology in this domain for teaching and learning, even before global pandemic? So that is something for us to ponder, I suppose, working in the education sector. And the second thing is, are we using technology for the sake of using technology in the process of teaching and learning? So reflecting on the support that we have provided in my previous and my current institution during lockdown, or during working from home time, like what we are still doing now here. A lot of times the technology platform that is already being provided at the institutions has existed for more than 3 to 5 years at least. For example, the learning management system. So before the pandemic, it shows to us that before the pandemic, those functions on the learning management system haven't been tried, or haven't been used, or haven't been done, being utilized in the process of teaching and learning before. And hence, when it is needed, when there's no other choice, then the support is needed. So for us, it shows that, you know, are we actually ready for this? And the third thing is kind of like some sort of conception of the technology in among teachers and students. So there's this first picture. Before the lockdown happened back in 2020, one professor came to the support session and say, because we are allowed to take our desktop computer home because to support some people who may not have fully equipped technologies at home. So one of them asked a question. Nowadays, the desktop doesn't have a mark holder. And we are all not sure what to answer. And then we were like, well, what is the mark holder to do with computer? So after a little bit of chat, we realized that it's that or DVD-ROM place that she has been using it as a mark holder. So that conception of the use of technology is simply amazing and fascinating working in this field. And from the student side, and when I collect data from the student looking into how they use technologies over the years, for example, if they are being given a dual screen, they will be using it as a notice board. They paste papers on it because they think that will be easier rather than having a dual screen. And again, in the education sector, one of the questions we always ask in the central unit is, how are we going to teach or learn the ways ICT should be used in this process? So recently, there's from World Economic Forum, they say, is academia losing its chance to capitalize on technology? So I think that is worth pondering as well. So in short, I think as an academic developer for a number of years now, I think we may have some sort of long-established perspectives about how we teach or how we learn. And that is hard to change. Or maybe we have some resistance to change. So from the academic side, a lot of the time, they would tell us something like, if there is no problem, why do we need to create a problem to change? Or from the student side, when you introduce a tool, they will be like, well, there is a big learning curve. I do have other priorities like finishing the assignments. But they forgot that if they know how to use the digital technologies in a more efficient and effective ways, they could have finished our assignments in a more proficient manner. So lastly, I think I don't have any sort of conclusion like Joe and Matt, because I'm still continuously looking into this aspect. But I think until we have some sort of identify the conception of how digital technologies will play a role in teaching and learning, then only the potential will be seen for digital pedagogy per se to be developed through academic development. And last year, Mike and I wrote a chapter in the book, and then I think this quote suits this topic well. In order to look into the future, maybe we should reframe the roles of technology as a tool in education, as well as we think our roles as academics or students, in order to make full use of our digital technologies to enhance teaching and learning experiences. So that's all from me for now. Thank you, Mike.
Awesome. Thanks, Kwong Nui. Yes, I was going to summarize you, but you summarized yourself. And you not only summarized yourself, you summarized yourself with a quote from you and I. We get bonus points, I think, for doing that, right? So thank you so much for doing that and talking to that. And so last, to finish us off, and then, ladies and gentlemen, we will move on to open questions. And so if you have a question you'd like to be fielded, please type it into the Q&A here in the webinar, and I'll see if we get a chance. And we should have about a half an hour to do that. But before we get on to that, I'm going to finish with Robert, who's going to talk to us a little bit about awareness and self-control. And as I said, Robert is an expert in the education space. He's a senior lecturer at University. And so, Robert, tell us why you think awareness and self-control is so important for these digital natives, if I'm allowed to use the term digital native.
Yeah, I always try to first throw like my perspective up and then put it in. So I'm a developmental psychologist from, California. I grew up in New York, but California. And so I tend to look at pedagogy and development. And for me, my framework is sort of as a belief system that every human develops the same, in that the difference is when and where and how they develop, right? So we all kind of know developmentally we're going to learn language, but if you go develop in France, you'll speak French. And if you live in America, you'll speak American English, which is funny. Moving to Australia, which speaks an Australian English, right? So the time and culture in which you develop is going to control a lot of that development, even though we'll still have some concepts of well-being and all these things. And I consider myself as a modern classicist. So all these conversations we're talking about safety and well-being and what's going on with technology. If you historically look back, when the pencil was invented, this research was being done the same thing. It's going to ruin the mind of youth, that they won't have to remember everything, right? Because the training at that time was you went to academia to memorize the Bible, right? And you knew everything in it. And you were a soothsayer that told stories because you remembered everything. Now that you could take notes and you didn't have to memorize everything, how will our brains adapt, right? So I look at everything from a more like from a developmental perspective. So when I talk about self-control and awareness, I always tie it as to how does a human grow and how do they have the ability to develop self-control as a species? And then how do you add technology to it? I can give a quick example of, I have a 17-year-old son. I gave my son a phone when he was 5 and everybody was like, why? I said, because at 5, he listens to me. If I give my son a phone at 14, he's purposely gonna say, he's gonna do the opposite of anything I say developmentally. So if I give him the device I want him to self-control on at an age at which his self-control is to ignore dad, it won't work, right? And I look at it from a development perspective of, I want to help him become self-aware or self-conscious at something at an age and into his development process where he might listen to me. So we talked a lot when he was really little about what is this phone? What does this thing do? What things do you have to be aware about? What access does it have? And you can use technology as developing awareness in the same thing that historically we used to think. We talk about either sexual awareness or predator awareness much later in life. But as traveling increased, we started saying, no, we need to talk about this earlier, you know, as just younger and younger. And you could almost make an argument, our awareness has to be the same with technology and talking to kids about it at a younger and younger age so that developmentally they're growing with the devices that are there. I see it all the time because I love being around families and structures, and kids want to play with their parents' phones. And you can't blame the kid because the parent's playing with the phone, right? So the kid just wants to play. And if you give them a plastic phone, they know it's a plastic phone. They don't. Many people will give their old phone to their kid because they don't want to play with a plastic phone, right? So they're aware of the phone, even if you think they're not, because when you try to give them a toy phone, they know it's not the real phone. So you want to start thinking about this importance of they're aware whether you think they are or not. The awareness is happening. Then the question is, looking back at the safety and the other issues, how do we teach them and how do we help them develop a self-control? And one of the things that I can kind of wrap this up with, which is weird for me as a developmental person, right? Because the research in psychology with social interactions prior to the tech boom has actually been an argument that in today's modern world, we very rarely let kids be alone together. You know, we will go, well, we're going to take them to a sporting function where they have a coach and then take them to this where they have a coach. So we don't even let kids go outside and play by themselves anymore. You could get turned into social services if you let your kid at 8 go down the neighborhood and not be protected, right? So when we talk about how do we teach them how to have self-control with technology, we always say, well, they don't go outside and play. And I always say, but would you let them? And if you wouldn't let them go outside and play, what is the counter action, right? So what I'm going to propose as I wrap up is like, we have to start thinking of what we can give to our students to stop the addiction. So my son does a lot of work with building crafts. He actually really, really loves building cosplay. And when I asked him, like, why did you start doing cosplay? And he went, because I had to have something to do instead of being on the computer. You talk to me, Dad, about, you know, I need to be aware and not be addicted to this thing, but I didn't have anything else to do, Dad. And we came up with this idea that he start building crafts. He has a whole workshop, right, where he goes to do things. So one of the things to think about when you talk to your kids and talk about how to be aware and how to manage addictiveness and all these other things is, if we don't actually come up with things as a community that kids can do in alteration to being on these technology devices, we won't be able to stop addiction because we're just going to tell them, don't use the computer and go to your room. And what else do they have, right? So you have to think about, as you're preparing them to be not addicted to something, how to provide them an alternative and help them grow through that.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Hot take. Siki University educational psychologist says that all kids should have mobile phones at 5. That's yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what I said.
that's the hot
That's what I
take.
said.
Yeah, but and also I think everybody at this point is going to think that I'm stacking the panel with people that think that they should all have technology, because I just mentioned that to Joe as well, and I guarantee that I am not. Although I will say that I, of course, would pick people that have a positive view of technology for the panel. That makes sense. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to some open-ended questions. And as I said, if you have any questions, please share them in the chat. And I see that some people are doing that, or alternatively, use the Q&A function here on the webinar session, and I will see if we can work in your questions. So I'm going to start with a broad question, and I actually had a question for you about what you think is different in the world post-digital. And I think this dovetails really well with a question that David has asked in the Q&A, which is specifically, why do we think, and Robert kind of implied this with his pencil analogy, why do we think that technology has special attributes that mean that we need to give it some sort of special attention here? Why is technology different, or is technology different? Now I'm going to ask everybody, but I'm probably going to, I think this one starts with Joe. So why do you think tech's different, Joe? Oh, you're on mute, Joe.
I can answer this lots of different ways, so it's kind of, which way will I go for that I'll share with everyone? I wrote an article at the end of last year, which is what I'm going to talk about. At the end of the last year, I personally was so exhausted, and everyone around me was saying the same thing, that they were more tired than they normally are at the end of the year. It just seemed to be a comment that I kept hearing. And when I really thought about that and kind of did some analysis of it, the way I saw it was that we'd spent the last 2 years, you know, in a pandemic, but really we experienced that pandemic via our technology use. So for most of us, for 2 years, COVID was experienced by going online massively, try and find out the latest information, and really urgent information that we needed around things like, you know, case numbers, restrictions, what is COVID, how do I use a breakout room on Zoom, you know, all the massive changes that came into our world because of COVID. And we used our technology to gather the information, and we kind of did it a bit unrelentingly. So we were on there much more than we ever normally would be prior to COVID. So late last year, when we considered how exhausted we were, the way I understood it is that we were suffering from information overload. So 2 years of so much information and trying to analyze it and apply that information, and then more and more and more information, that we were really kind of experiencing exhaustion, forgetfulness, just being constantly kind of tired. So I think that coming out of COVID and kind of the new digital, or how we're describing it, we're starting to see what using technology badly actually looks like, and how it can actually affect us in ways that we may never have thought of. So one of the things that has always sat for me is that we can predict how we are going to use a new platform or how we're going to use a new device. But the reality is often it's quite different to what we've predicted. And I think we've talked about things like information overload, but yet never really understood what that might mean. And I think, you know, COVID is starting to give us insight into what these kinds of effects of technology can have on us physically, mentally, emotionally, and how it impacts the rest of our life.
That's awesome, Joe. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about that they want to share about why you think the world might be different and why technology needs this special touch? And maybe you argue and say, no, that's not true. It doesn't need a special touch. It's no different.
I thought it was interesting sharing some of the Joe's interpretation, which I agree with, which else different. Like when I moved to Australia right before COVID, I had already had to adapt to gathering all my information digitally, right? Because I left a country I grew up in, and all my friends were there, right? And you can't just reinvent yourself at 45 in a completely new country. So I had already shifted to all my friends calling on the phone, using Marco Polo because we had different time zones to talk to each other, and you know, and then moving here, not having any friends at first and having to do all that stuff. And what hit me when if we talk about the digital era and COVID, opposed to the digital era with the beginning of the phone or the beginning of the computer, and we seem to be centering around COVID. So I'll stick with around the digital change due to COVID. What hurt me was I'm an extremely extroverted person, and it wasn't information overload, it was personality underwhelmment. I could no longer be around people. I could no longer, and meetings and Zooms for me, like if you watch my face this meeting, I feel like a loser because I can't interact. I stare at a screen. And so all my interpersonal desires, being super extroverted, are crushed. And I was always tired because I couldn't be my own innate personality style in COVID. Every meeting I had was on Zoom. Every human interaction I had was on Zoom. And I'm not innately good for that. Whereas I'm interested to find out, are there certain people that it was better for them because they could have their Zoom time, and then if you're introverted, go to your room and be alone and process with that in a different way than that might work, you know? And what I do see is as a change to support Joe is one of the downsides of not technology change, but pandemic change, right? Is pandemic change can force us to accept bad actions in that, well, at least we aren't dying anymore. At least people aren't really seriously getting sick. So what we'll do is adapt some of the things we did in order to survive a pandemic where we use technology, opposed to a natural digital progression, right? Because there is a natural digital progression that happens, but I think we're really dealing with post-pandemic digital progression, which is an alteration to the natural progression technology and a new innovation or a new device.
Oh, I love it. Post-pandemic digital progression. You can put that in quotes. Matt's going to answer our question and give us some insight. I was also going to ask Matt if he wants to address this as well. You work in health, obviously, where face-to-face interaction is really important. Do you think things are going to bounce back? Robert highlighted digital fatigue. Do you think things will bounce back? But respond to Robert first, if you'd like, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I mentioned earlier, pandemic is a disruptor, and the irony, of course, is that digital was classed as a disruptor. And in fact, I gave an oration to the Australian Computer Society that my title was "Embracing Digital Disruption to Advance Clinical Research," and, you know, advocating that digital was really important. And of course, what are the issues that we sort of encountered? Challenging tradition. You know, we heard prior to the pandemic, call centres can't be virtual. Challenging skill sets, inciting fear for rapid change, decision paralysis, imposing the sort of waterfall models for development to ICT versus the DevOps sort of agile, you know, it's a disabler. Some of these terms just sort of came up in the digital. But what's happened post-COVID, certainly we've transitioned to digital being the enabler. We've embraced the concept to be fully immersed in digital transformation. Then that opens up, I guess, a whole new plethora of opportunities, cross-boundary interactions, non-obvious interactions. And so certainly, you know, we saw mid-COVID video conferencing platforms that perhaps weren't so secure, you know, suddenly became secure. And you can't be paranoid in retrospect. And I think that's a really important dimension. So security became front and center. And then the other dimension I think is really important, and Joe sort of talked about it, the work from home arrangements was no longer the exception. You know, telecommuting is now a norm. And what we found when we're trying to recruit e-research personnel, you know, business analysts, software developers, DevOps specialists, you name it, we were used to be able to highlight that, you know, recruitment was flexible and the flexible work arrangements. Now it's the norm. You know, there's an increased demand living in rural and regional areas, which is now placing greater emphasis, as I mentioned, in mobile broadband coverage. And I think the other dimension to digital, which is really important, is that it gives assistance to supporting diversity in our workforce. And if I were to talk about, you know, neurodiversity, this becomes really quite important. And the other question was, sorry.
Well, I think you've answered it. Are we going to bounce back? Are we going to bounce back to the way things are? And I think your answer is no.
I think I think just to add, I guess the other dimension to it, we can now start to focus on the non-technical sides of digital more fully, and the other speakers have already, panelists have already mentioned it, but the end user experiences and engagement, and David made that comment about what's the difference in measuring impact. Certainly Kwong Nui has highlighted that. Innovation and co-design of products and services, this becomes completely a game changer. Maximal use of data and analytics, embracing data governance and partnerships. I think they're the key messages.
Awesome. I could feel the researcher coming out there in data, in Matt's response, data analytics. This is all for research. Go for it, Robert.
I want to quickly mention that rhetoric, right? So the bounce back, right? There's an old adage that you can never step into a river at the same place ever again, right? Because once you've stepped there, you've altered the flow of the river, and now that's changed, right? Life has never, ever, ever bounced back. It's always bouncing somewhere else, right? We don't bounce back, but we want to use that phraseology because it gives us a sense of emotional safety. There is never a bounce back. Life is always moving forward, right? The rhetoric of let's look back to the olden days, you can't even see the olden days the way they were. You're looking back at them through the lens of today that controls what you thought they were back then. That's even how memory works. Memory is a reflective moment of a past experience in the moment of it. You can't ever see the moment in the moment. You have to recognize the moment, right? Rethink it, recognize. So we use this terminology. Will we bounce back? Well, we never did. We won't bounce back tomorrow to today, right? And so the question is more around discussing bouncing forward, and do we want to bounce the ball more this way, or bounce it more that way, or bounce it more this way? Because the reality is no life ever bounces back. You don't go to yesterday, right? But you can learn from yesterday and change where you go tomorrow in today. And I like that rhetoric, like opposed to we're never bouncing back. That's just never happened. Never has, never will.
I should have known when I wrote that question and said bounce back that Robert had called me on the rhetoric. That's Robert all over, right? Yes, indeed, Robert. I think bounce, what direction are you going to bounce in, not bounce back, I think is what I would go for. So I'm going to ask Kwong Nui just to finish us up on this particular area. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I might ask you my last cheeky question. Higher education, obviously, Kwong Nui, I said to Matt that health is one of those areas where we think things could bounce back, right? Higher education is worse, right? I often talk about the professor with the tweed jacket and the chalk, right? I think if we had the choice in higher education, we'd all still be using chalkboards and overhead projectors, or at least some of us, right? Do you think, as somebody who works in that space, do you think higher education is going to significantly change? Is it going to change, and are we going to move forward, as Matt highlighted, because we have to?
Yeah, similar as what Robert has said, I don't think we can bounce back. It's the matter of how much change we wanted to have in the education sector. So for example, now, in order to bounce back, we are being encouraged to start returning to the campus, for example. And I guess that links back to the conception of education, because like it or not, teaching and learning is a kind of social activity. The interaction, we come to the university to study or go to school to study, is more than just the knowledge, but also the people skills. When anything happened, pandemic or natural disasters happen, like 10 years ago in New Zealand, the Christchurch earthquake, it has already happened once, but luckily touched one off. And it's a smaller scale than compared to global pandemic. So when the physical space are being removed or disrupted, all I can think of is to use digital technologies to continue. What else can we do? Maybe we can print out the materials and send it by post, but that's taking a lot of time when physical space is being disrupted. So until we find another solution, I think we are just going to keep changing within higher education, or even just education sector in general. And it's how much the change should be, because I think the more complex aspects within the education is not only the digital part, but also I think education sector from now on will have to operate in a very different economic, social, and political climates, such as people will start asking, what's the value of higher education, you know? Or going overseas to do a degree and doing it from home. You know, when that digital space come into the picture, as a student, if I were a student again, I would start thinking about that. Secondly, the staff and student mobility, virtual conferences. So we are no longer that mobile like before. So before global pandemic, we used to attend conferences or symposium or get together. So for example, the Escalate executive meetings have been, you know, we carry on with the meetings, but it's in a different sense, in a different manner. We just have to change the ways of doing things. Or people start looking into the sustainability issues like the access and the equity, so on and so forth. So I think moving forward, it seems like the situation or the impacts from the bigger
It looks like we may have lost Kwong Nui, but she was winding up anyway, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure she'll come back in a minute. So we have 7 minutes left before we need to finish, and so hopefully Kwong Nui will come back. Oh, there she is. Awesome.
So finish my last sentence. I don't know where I stopped, but the last sentence will be.
Goodness me. Oh, and we lost it. She's not going to finish her last sentence. Yeah, go for it.
Look, this is the joy of using technology.
I was going to say, Kwong Nui's hot take is that technology has changed education forever, which there's a certain irony in the fact that she got cut off at the end.
About right.
Yes.
And Michael, I'll just add to it, and just I was going to answer Kwong Nui's sentence, that there's a new field of research, FOR code, which is learning analytics. You know, and so that is, I guess, the essence of this higher education space, and that cross-disciplinary interaction become really important. Measuring what we do, and is it actually more effective or not?
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matt.
Good point, Matt, because I actually changed my last sentence because of what I have experienced being cut off. My last sentence actually was on the positive note that it's a chance for us to reimagine the education from now on. So like virtual university or so on and so forth. But anyway, thank you, Matt. That's a really good point. Over to you.
Good save, Matt.
My reality this week is that all our lectures at my university have been scrapped from now on. So we no longer actually give lectures.
Wow.
So I've spent this week and the next few weeks recording little lecture pods. So I think the skills that are required of academics now have completely changed.
Yep.
And your ability to use a screen has really stepped up in the demands for editing and so forth. And I always think it's pretty interesting that we're called lecturers, but we don't give lectures anymore. So we need a new title as well.
We need a new job title. I like that. That's Joe Orlando's hot take. Yeah, I love it. I'm going to ask my last question, ladies and gentlemen. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. And my last question is a little bit of a cheeky question, right? So in 60 seconds or less, tell me what you think a future prediction movie might be that describes what you think the world will be like in 10, 50, 20 years, however long you want to think of. And I'll give you the option of choosing a dystopian movie, we're all going to be in the Matrix, or a utopian movie like, you know, Bicentennial Man with Robin Williams as our robot butler. So I'm going to start with, I'm looking at faces to see who looks like they've got a good answer. I'm going to start with Matt.
I was challenged with this one, Michael. I couldn't decide between The Accountant, which is supporting that neurodiversity space. I'm a Star Trek fan, so that acceptance of cultural diversity. The Atom Project, which you can go back in time to perhaps revise digital reputations. But I think because it's Centre for Data Science, I'm part of the Centre for Data Science as well, in another hat that I wear. I'm thinking Centre of Data Science when I say The Minority Report.
The Minority, Tom Cruise. Okay. Oh, we'll let that one sit.
Kwong Nui, all that data together.
Yeah. Oh, moving all the data. Okay, now. Okay. Kwong Nui, what do you think?
Sorry, Mike. I said none of them will represent, especially from the education perspective, because I always think digital technologies are from humans for humans. So I think especially within the education sector, I think we determine how digital technologies to be used. And I will sum it up with one of the quotes I quite like: education is not preparation for life, but education is life itself.
Oh, there we go. Well, my counterpoint to that would be the movie The Time Machine, where he goes into the future and all of the books have disintegrated. I always imagine him taking the book off the shelf and it disintegrates in his hand. But hopefully that's not where we end up. Who else? Robert, have you got a thought? You're on notice because you only got this question yesterday, but
for me, it's problematic as a huge fan of cinematography, right? I sometimes feel that what Hollywood does is purposely make movies about technology to stop the technology from going that way. So when you look at most movies like The Minority Report or these things when cloning was a possibility, they make these fear-mongering movies about the downside of cloning, and then no one talks about cloning research anymore, and it doesn't get funded, so it goes away. So I actually look at the movies as a way that people that want to have social change stop it. They put fear into the people of this type of technology developing, right? So you got Upload, the new TV show, where we're gonna move and then put fear into this type of a world, and then people don't get funding for it because people won't support politics for it. And I think that the reality is the movies don't come true because they're used in a way to stop it from happening, which, you know, we try to look at what from Back to the Future happened, and none of it.
yeah, oh, that's very interesting. Did you know that the first time the word robot was ever used was in the context of things that were going to kill a whole bunch of people and take over the world? So the word, so maybe Robert has something there. Maybe that's, yeah, we shouldn't nominate a movie. Sorry, Matt, we're not going to get Minority Report now because you mentioned it. And last but not least, Joe, what do you think? Have you got a good choice?
Yeah, well, let me go with the rom-com line now. So I think Her, you know, where Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with his operating system, which happens to be the voice of Scarlett Johansson. I think, you know, we're all in our homes online. Are we talking to a real person or not? Who knows? I think we're getting to that point. So I think that's a possibility. And I've got one more, which is WALL-E, which is a kids' movie, where the movie is around, there's so much pollution on Earth that, you know, they're blasted into space and live in space. But part of that movie has always stuck with me, where they put a chip in their brain and they just stream advertising into their thoughts. So I think that kind of is a possibility in terms of notifications from social media and the massive amount of advertising that's in our world now.
Oh, a very dystopian choice.
Yes.
I love it though. Awesome answer. My answer is going to be iRobot, because then we've got a robot to slap Will Smith back, right? But no, I actually love that movie because it is based on all of the work of Asimov, and I think the 3 laws of robotics. And so despite the fact that the movie's an action movie and got Will Smith in it, I think it's a great story. If you put that aside about how I'd love the world to be in, say, 20 years. Okay, that's it. We're at 1 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. I think that was a rigorous and great discussion. And I'm going to say thank you individually to Joe Orlando. Thank you, Matt Bellgard, Robert Vanderburg, and Kwong Nui Sim. Thank you so much for coming along. And of course, thank you so much to the QUT Centre for Data Science and also the Queensland Academy of Arts and Science for organising this session. See you, everybody. Have a really good day. And if you want to talk to us, let us know.